Hi, I'm Jaewon, and you are listening to a musical soliloquy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a musical soliloquy. This is episode number 26. My name is Stephen Song, and I have the pleasure of interviewing one of my good violin friends, Jaewon Seo, from the Grand Rapids Symphony currently. So, in today's interview, we're going to ask Jaewon about his musical upbringing, his inspirations and mentors, and finally, what he's doing now. So, Jaewon, take me back to the beginning of when you started music and the violin.
The very first instrument that I started on was actually on piano. First and foremost, actually, my mom is a piano teacher, and music was always in the house. Growing up in the house, my mom was always teaching piano students, playing at church, and music was kind of always in the family. And when I was 5, I heard a violinist at church playing I think some Bach piece. I can't remember the exact piece, but I was so drawn by the beauty of the sound of the violin. And I begged my mom in the beginning, and she was very hesitant at first, knowing how difficult music was, but she eventually kind of gave in and actually gave me the violin for my 8th Christmas present. And I started my first violin lesson when I was 9. Piano started when I was around 5, but after 2 weeks, my mom kind of gave up on me because she thought the piano wasn't the right instrument for me, and we kind of left it from there.
So, there was like a good 3 to 4 year gap between.
Yeah, my mom just didn't want me to go into music in the first place, but I think I was begging for a violin since I heard the performance at church, and my mom prolonged it till I was 8.5. So it kind of started from there.
I see. Wonderful. Yeah, a lot of people start with either piano or violin, so that sounds pretty typical. And
Mm.
so, violin really became your destiny. And so, you picked up the violin, and what was your first teacher like and first few years?
My first violin teacher was a Suzuki pedagogy teacher. I can't remember her last name, but her name was Irose, and I think she was the one that first taught me Suzuki. Her teaching method was just to have fun and give a lot of passion and joy to the students. It was just for fun, and she nurtured my passion for music at an early age. And we just started off with no pressure, just having fun and having 30-minute lessons per week kind of teacher. And it was just about a year with her. Eventually, after a year, our family actually moved to Fredericton, New Brunswick in Canada. And I met this another teacher by the name Sylvie Rose. And she eventually kind of moved away from Suzuki, and she was transition teacher between someone who wanted to teach me seriously and someone who was just kind of teach me for fun. And she started to kind of teach me fundamentals that would help me start to eventually pursue into music. But it was only for 1 year with her in Fredericton. And with her, I ended up moving away from Suzuki books to just regular teaching methods, Shredyak and subject, and all these important skill sets to improve on violin. And after 1 year, because of my dad's job, we moved again to Australia, Melbourne. I think we lived there for around a year and a half to 2 years. And I met the teacher, Jiwon Kim, who actually was a soloist at that time. And she was finishing up I think her master's or I can't remember, but she was competing in international competitions like Michael Hill competition and did a lot of competitions in her years. And she was quite of a young teacher, and she was actively performing. And I met her through someone's recommendation, and she saw a potential in me. She started giving me lessons, and then eventually thought I need to expand from an hour lesson per week to 2 lessons, and then started taking me seriously as a student that would maybe consider going to music. So that was the transition where I thought maybe music could be a profession for me. And that was around age 11 to 12. And then all of a sudden, she started giving me very difficult pieces like Mendelssohn Concerto, Bach. And then from there, it kind of started to progress very quickly.
Awesome. That sounds like a very varied journey to begin with. So, I actually didn't know you moved to Australia for a year, so that must have been an experience. What do you think it was like moving and also moving violin teachers?
It was always an adjustment, not only for music, but for my personal life too. So I always have to feel like I was always put myself out there to socialize with people, meet people, and try to adapt to the new environment, which I think it did help because I was trying to absorb as many things as I could, like a sponge. It was scary at first, but as I moved quite a bit, I started to kind of adapt to learning new things out there. And I think it gave me a very open mindset of learning different things around me. And maybe that might have helped me in my music making too. So it was good to be in all kinds of different environments for myself.
Yeah. Do you think it was actually good to have that progression of teachers from one that was strictly Suzuki and more just trying to instill love to slightly more serious, and then finally a teacher that would take things quite seriously?
I think for me, that was the perfect transition. If I started off with a teacher that was very serious, I don't know if I would have had the passion or the love of music that I would still have today. So I thank those teachers that I met when I first started on the violin.
I see. That sounds good to me. So you mentioned this teacher, Jiwon Kim. So you worked with her for a few years in Australia, but then you eventually moved back to Canada. And so who did you study with after?
After living in Melbourne for a year and a half, we actually moved back to Vancouver and I was there for 6 months. And I think my dad was looking for a job then. And ultimately, we moved back to Ottawa because our family remembered that city as a really good place that we were before. And that's where I actually started out learning violin lessons too. So we moved back after 6 months after living in Vancouver. We moved back to Ottawa. My dad eventually moved back to Korea to support us, and my mom and my sister and I were lived in Ottawa for around I think it was 6 to 7 years. I finished my middle school and high school in Ottawa, and that's where I met Lane Klimasko, who was actually Zuckerman's TA. Through her, she was in the National Arts Center Orchestra, and through her, I was able to attend the orchestra concerts and get to hear lots of wonderful performance by Pinchas Zukerman, Gil Shaham, James Ennis, and all these amazing performers every month. So it was a really great exposure to me, as well as getting all the information from my teacher Elaine, who was working with Pinchas Zukerman while I was there. So it was very helpful.
I see. Yeah. So I actually didn't know you had a sister, despite us know each other for so long. Did she study music as well?
She did. She actually started off on piano, and then eventually in her middle school years, she wanted to learn a string instrument. So she actually played cello for her middle school and high school years. And eventually, I think she ended up not pursuing into music, but going into academics because I think she had more of an interest in that area in mental health psychology. So I guess my sister and I kind of branched off. I went into music and she went into academia.
Yeah. And you mentioned your dad moved back to Korea. And so during those middle school to high school years, were you basically supported by your mom for all those years?
Mom and dad. My dad was financially providing, and my mom was there to support me as well because she was also a musician. So she would help me out in my practice too, and also just to look out for my sister and I while we were living in Ottawa.
I see. Yeah. But I imagine, having only your mom physically there, that it would be pretty tough. But I guess also because she was a musician, that must have helped you in some ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think she knew when to push me and when not to push me, knowing that she also pursued to music. And she was always attentively listening to how I practice. So she would always give me some tips how to do certain things. And that really helped my development throughout my high school years before going to college.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm the same as you. I have an older brother who also learned music, but didn't pursue it professionally. Was
Mhm.
it difficult having a family member be a musician? Because you see this sometimes musician families, their parents do music and it can be kind of a rough relationship. Was yours healthy for the most part?
I think so. Sometimes she was very strict and very intense when she wanted to help me, but ultimately, I know she wanted to help me and get better. She pushed me just the right amount. And I think it was a healthy relationship with my mom and I with her help.
I see. That sounds good. And I'm happy that it was that case. And I'm just curious, because she was a pianist, was she able to help you accompany a lot of the time?
At home, she would practice with me, but she would never go to like an audition or competition and accompany me, but she would always play the parts at home with me. So, but I wish that we would have performed together, but my mom was very shy about performing on stage with me. So it was fun playing at home with her.
Yeah, for sure. I imagine it's a lot of pressure to have a family member be a musician, but there's obviously a lot of benefits as well. So, you talked about your teacher and studying with her and also her connection to Mr. Zuckerman. I know that you went to Mr. Zuckerman's Young Artist program back when it was still a thing in Ottawa, Canada. So, what was that experience like? How many years did you go, and finally studying with Mr. Zukerman?
So I started studying with Elaine Klimasko, I think in my middle school, grade 7. And I attended the Zuckerman program by the time when I was in grade 8 to grade 12. I would get regular lessons with Elaine, but sometimes if I had extra time, I would get a few lessons from Zuckerman just during the summer when he was available. And it was eye-opening seeing him demonstrate and perform with his in the lesson. It was such a big and beautiful sound, and it just kind of fill up the room. And I just remember the sound just had so much presence. I wanted to just emulate the sound that he created. Since then, I've been auditioning to the Zuckerman program since then till grade 12. Even until now, I still listen to his recordings and I'm very inspired by his playing.
Yeah. So speaking about the Zuckerman program, that's like a 2 to 3 week summer program in Ottawa, and Zuckerman selects the students or his assistant. And in the program, you get to study with Mr. Zuckerman and you play chamber music. And I had some friends do it and I heard it's a lot of fun. So you said you auditioned quite a few times. When did you eventually end up getting in?
Actually, I applied to the program in my 8th grade. For some reason, I went to the program for 5 years, from grade 8 to grade 12. I guess it was 5 years being there. And for me, it was just going there, play music, meet some friends. And actually, through that festival, I met wonderful friends, like even friends I still keep in touch today. They really inspired me and motivated me to play even better. It has been such a memorable experience for me.
Yeah, I could only imagine because I haven't been there. Fast forward to undergraduate, and
Yeah.
you attended the Cleveland Institute of Music.
Mhm.
So, what was your undergrad audition process like, and what led you to CIM?
So Elaine Klimasko was recommending me to CIM because she told me that she is very close friends with Jamie Laredo and Bill Prusso at that time. And she thought CIM will be a wonderful program for me to go there. And also knowing that the Cleveland Orchestra was also members were faculties at the Cleveland Institute of Music. So she was highly recommending me to audition there. I didn't know anything about the school, but trusting my teacher that that school would be wonderful, I applied to Cleveland Institute of Music, CIM, and somehow I got in at the very last minute, and I got into the studio of Ivan Zenaty, who is a very well-known Czech violinist, soloist, and he took me as a student, and ended up studying with him for 3 years there.
I see, yeah. What about the fourth year?
So after the 3rd year, there was a lot of faculty changes that was happening at CIM, and there was a lot of uncertainty with what was going to happen with the faculty changes. And unfortunately, my teacher had to leave the school, and they were bringing new faculty. And during that process, they brought in 3 new teachers just to temporarily fill in the positions. Were Philip Setzer from Emerson Quartet, Kathleen Winkler from Rice University, and I think it was Brian Lewis at Texas University, and ended up having a split studio with Joan Kwan, at that time was the head of the string department, and Philip Setzer. And they were very, very helpful, and they were very encouraging during that time. And they knew what was happening at the school. So they were very, very accommodating and helping us to get through the last year. And for me, at least, it was a smooth transition period, even with all the big changes happening.
Yeah, so CIM has had a lot of faculty changes, and even when I was there, I went there a little bit after you, and I experienced major faculty changes as well, although a big part of it was someone's passing. I know a little bit about Mr. Zenaty because actually he taught at Meadowmount when I was there, and I heard him play, and he was really wonderful, very nice person. What sort of influence did he have on your playing? Because I think he must be a little bit different from the Zuckerman school.
When I first met him, he was asking me who I study with, and I said Zuckerman. I think he was very fond of Zuckerman. He loved his style playing. So he didn't really change what I did before, but he was just working on just the fundamental things to develop my technique. In terms of concept of sound and using the bow, we just worked on fundamentals like, legato, spiccato, just all the really basics that he wanted to solidify with me. So in terms of sound concept, it wasn't a big drastic change, but it was just building off from what I had before.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And knowing him, I was struck by his sound because he has a very fast vibrato and it's this sort of arm vibrato. But being a Czech violinist, he also has a certain affinity to those Czech works such as Dvorak and in particular Joseph Suk, I remember, and Smetana. I remember one recording live performance actually at Meadow Mount that I heard, and we were actually really blown away by it. So, did he make you play a bunch of Czech works?
He did. I mean, in the lesson, I would ask him, what piece should I play? And then one time they recommend me the Dvorak Violin Concerto because his teacher was Joseph Suk, knowing he's the grandson of Antonin Dvorak. And he recommended me that, and I started learning that piece in my beginning of my sophomore year. And I remember he gave me all these bowings and fingerings just for me to try, and I looked at it. If it weren't for his part, I would have never approached it that way. But seeing how he demonstrated in the lesson and showing me his bowings and fingerings, it really gave me a new approach of the piece, and it started to grow onto me after learning that piece with him.
Yeah, awesome. So, in general, what was your time at CIM like? Obviously, undergraduate, it's a big growing period of our life, but of course, CIM being next to the Cleveland Orchestra. But just being in Cleveland, what was that like? Because for those that don't know, Cleveland, it's a cool city, but it's got its quirks. And just what do you recommend people going to CIM?
At least for my experience in Cleveland, I think the big part for me to go to Cleveland was because of the Cleveland Orchestra that was so close by to the school. And when I entered the school, it seemed like the school environment, the faculty of the school was just amazing. And that was my only priority for me to go to the school. But outside of that, I didn't really go around, like to baseball games or going outside and discover the city. So kind of a boring life, but the friends there I met, they really filled my time up. And it felt, at least for me, that 4 years in Cleveland was a very wonderful and wholesome time for me there. I think it was because of the people there that I met, and just the music and the people really filled me up.
Awesome. Yeah. I think Cleveland is actually a good place to focus on your music because, as I was implying before, I think there's not a ton to do there, but it's a really nice place. The University Circle, it's surrounded by trees. It's a nice place just to get work done. And so I think it's a very good place to go if you really just want to focus on your studies. So, fast forward to master's, you ended up at Rice University with Kathleen Winkler. Obviously, Rice is another big orchestra school. So was that really another big priority for you as you transitioned?
To be completely honest, when I was younger, going back, I guess a few steps back, my dream was to actually do competitions and really test myself to the limit and challenge myself and put myself out there. But through, I guess, just where I ended up in Cleveland, and through that, I ended up at Rice too. The teacher that I wanted to study with ended up in a school where they really focused on orchestra, which I didn't know, but ended up being there. And through Miss Winkler, Kathleen Winkler, my teacher, she really changed my perception of orchestra. And I thought solo playing gave you a lot of freedom and put yourself out there. But I realized through Winkler, orchestra is just a different outlet. She made me realize that orchestra will be a good fit for me. Through meeting her, I started to take orchestra very seriously. And through the school program, through the environment there, and through her learning the excerpts and taking orchestra auditions, made me realize, is orchestra something that I could see myself doing and start pursuing as a career for myself very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every violinist almost has that transition, if they do have it, to orchestra from solo. And it's something that I talk about a lot on this show, actually, because it's a pretty big deal. Of course, studying with a teacher like Miss Winkler, she has had a lot of success with students winning orchestra jobs. What was her philosophy behind orchestra auditions?
Through her orchestra excerpt classes, studio classes, and lessons, I realized that excerpts teaches you certain skill sets, and every excerpt has a task, and you have to know what the excerpt is asking for and know how to approach it. And before meeting Winkler, I approach every piece, everything out there very intuitively, but I think through excerpts, I had to change my mindset to being very logical and realize that every excerpt asks for different things, and I had to take things very logically and practice everything with more attention to detail. And it made me realize how I use my bow and how I use my left hand. And I had to really think how I was practicing.
I see, yeah. And were there any specific things that she did? Because I actually remember one of our friends, Paolo, he actually mentioned how when he went to Miss Winkler, he had her students play Kreutzer 2 over and over to work on détaché for the spiccato stroke. So were there things like that that you had to go through?
Unfortunately, yes. Actually, for me, I might have been the longest student that spent on Kreutzer 2. And we spent actually the whole first semester on Kreutzer 2. until I think it was the last 2 weeks before the end of the semester, she started giving me Mozart Violin Concerto number 5, just the first 2 lines. Before then, she wanted to just rework everything before, because I think the way I was playing before, I was working too hard to get the sound out rather than letting my arm bring out the natural overtones of the instrument. She was trying to help me use my natural way to get the most natural sound out of the instrument. And I really thank her a lot for her help. And she had been very patient with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just curious, do you think there is any sort of fundamental difference between her approach and Zukerman's approach, which is essentially the Galamian approach? Was there anything new you learned? Because in my opinion, all the fundamentals I think are essentially there with what Galamian taught. I think maybe just applying it more specifically to excerpts. But in terms of the extension of the forearm, which I know Miss Winkler talks about a lot, I mean, that's just a fundamental part about playing the violin.
For me, it was really listening to how the sound was coming out. Even more so with excerpts, I had to be more mindful of where I put my bow, how close I put my bow near the bridge. And I was working too hard to get the sound out, but she was telling me to use a lot more bow speed to get the natural resonance of the sound rather than pressing into the string and try to get a big sound playing right on top of the bridge in terms of approaching an excerpt.
I see, yeah. Well, that actually hits it right home. You've heard it here on a musical soliloquy that playing the violin isn't just about playing loud. And I guess, yeah, that would be the fundamental difference. I've said it before, but it's just an approach to the violin that allows the violin to speak most naturally rather than this 100% focused on bow technique, because I think what Mr. Galamian did is he basically made violin technique extremely easy and understandable for basically anyone. And he revolutionized violin technique. Basically, after Ivan Galamian, there became so many good violinists. And I think it's because he had a real easy and clear understanding of how the violin worked. But I think there's more nuance to it. And so, like I've talked about myself, I've also changed my approach to the instrument as well, studying with different teachers. Although I will say I had a very long Zukerman phase, and I think for some people, especially soloists like Zukerman, that sort of approach works very well, but it needs to be tailored to what you're doing. So for chamber music and excerpts, obviously you're not playing full sound close to the bridge all the time. So I think there's actually a lot to learn there playing orchestral excerpts. We've talked about this before, but you actually believe that orchestral excerpts are equally hard, if not harder, than solo repertoire. And can you just articulate a few of the reasons why you think that is?
Every extra has its challenges, and to really bring out those challenges in the span of 20 measures, I guess in an orchestra audition, you'll be only playing up to 5, 6 minutes. So you have to show as much content as possible, and they might only ask you to play 2 or 3 excerpts. So within that, you want to show as much control, poise, and thoughtfulness in how you use your instruments so that you could show that to a blind committee, which they don't see what you're doing, but they have to hear it. So you have to really exaggerate what you're doing and know exactly what you're doing for them to hear that and to want them to want to hear you again. I felt like I had to be in a more of a microscopic detail work, even more so in a short span of time.
Yeah, I think so. And that's something I've also talked about extensively on this show. When you're judged on one little thing, it's actually a lot harder than you would think, rather than being judged on a bigger thing. And of course, both are hard in different ways, but I think excerpts are particularly hard because it's just a couple fundamental techniques, but you have to get them down really solid. Whereas in a solo piece, if it's maybe 85% there, it's passable. And with the rest of the piece and with musicality, it's like, it's fine. And it's not a big deal if something isn't 100% perfect. But I think in excerpt playing, there's no cutting corners. It's really black and white. And so that's what makes it very difficult.
Yeah.
Besides just the violin and your teacher, Miss Winkler, which I know you're very focused on, what was Rice like as a school?
Rice for me, it has also been an eye-opening experience for me. And people there really took orchestra program rehearsals very seriously. And I remember people were so passionate about going and playing an orchestra piece. And before meeting Winkler, I didn't have that kind of seriousness in myself, unfortunately. But seeing people around me, seeing them so passionate and taking orchestra with such care really made me think, oh my goodness. And playing with them side by side together in a concert made me realize, oh, this is something maybe I would love to do. And it really shifted my mindset. And also working with at the time, there was Larry Ratcliffe, who unfortunately passed away a few years later, but he really opened me, really changed the way I see orchestra music, orchestra performances, and just the orchestra symphonic repertoire out there. And it really made me appreciate music so much, just overall. And it's beautiful. I think it's one of the most beautiful musical form out there, at least for me. But just seeing people around me care about music, symphonic work made me want to pursue into orchestral path.
Yeah, absolutely. For those that don't know, Rice, the School of Music, is called the Shepherd School of Music, and it was actually founded based off of the idea that they wanted to train orchestral players first and foremost. And so there's a couple solo focused people there, but I would say probably 90%, if not more, are orchestral focused. And so I think it must have been very eye-opening. And you mentioned Larry Ratcliffe. Although I never got to work with him, I heard so many great things about him, and we've talked about on this podcast about how great the orchestral music is and how it's great to serve an orchestra. And I do believe that orchestra music is one of the best forms of repertoire there is in our classical music field. So I think that's really amazing. And so fast forward, after 2 years at Rice, you actually 3 years, I believe, due to the pandemic, you ended up at the New World Symphony in Miami, is it?
Yes, Miami Beach. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is a orchestra training program, but it functions like a professional orchestra. You get a salary and a living stipend, but it's kind of like a transitionary program between a school and a professional orchestra. So do you think that experience was a real critical part for your growth?
Absolutely, Stephen. I think that gave me a taste of what a real orchestra season would be like if I were to join a real professional orchestra one day. And the vigorous week by week concerts we had to give every single week really kept me on my toes. And I had to start to learn how to time manage with repertoire, and certain repertoire I had to learn weeks in advance to prepare. And my first year, it was quite overwhelming for me to prepare week by week. And actually, the New World Symphony program gives you up to 3 years to be there. And people, when they're there, they're all eager to take auditions and try to join a professional orchestra. So managing the orchestra schedule there and also trying to prepare for an orchestra audition at the same time was overwhelming. It was overwhelming in terms of managing your time and energy, and it really pushed me to the limit there. Of course, through the experience there, learning amazing repertoire week by week, playing with amazing new guest conductors every single week. It was a very wonderful and inspiring experience for me. And if it weren't for that program, I don't know if I would have been ready to join a professional orchestra.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great training program for that purpose. And so,
Mm.
actually, not too long into that program, you were fortunate enough to win a job at the Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra, which you're at currently in Michigan. And so, we've already talked about your audition experience, but looking back, can you share a little bit about that experience? What were the 4 rounds like, and just preparing for it?
Before auditioning there, I took, I think, 3 auditions before then. I think I was very tired and exhausted from traveling, auditioning, and I was kind of at a point where I was like, I need a break in the summer. I was in Korea, and actually, our friend Paulo Dara, he was in Grand Rapids then, and he sent me a text, and then it's like, oh, Grand Rapids is having an audition. And he was like, Jill, do you want to come? Do you want to come take the audition? And he kind of convinced me to take the audition because he's like, oh, you could stay at my place. And I was hesitant. I was like, should I go? Should I not go? I came back home and I had 3 weeks to prepare before the audition. I started practicing with no pressure, just hoping to catch up with my friend. And I think it was a week before I was running through for people. And my wife, Shirley, she was one that was giving me comments on how to fix my excerpts. And through the last week, got ready last minute and took the audition with no expectations. And then somehow I ended up in the final. And Paula and myself and the person that is in the orchestra now, three of us got to the finals. There were 4 one-year contract people that was competing with me in the super final. So ultimately, there were 7 people. Actually, during that time, simultaneously, Paulo was taking principal viola audition and he won the position and ended up not following through with the violin audition. But my friend Clara, who's in the orchestra now, and I got to the superfinals with another person who was in the orchestra and ultimately ended up picking Clara and myself to join the orchestra.
Just in terms of your playing, how did you think your playing went? Obviously, it must have been good enough to pass, but do you think it was a stressful experience performing, even though you had already taken a few auditions?
I was very nervous for sure. I was very, very nervous, but I didn't put any pressure on myself knowing how little time I had to prepare. But I just kind of trust in the work that I did and not thought too much. I was playing along with the recording. When I was playing my exercise, I was thinking about the orchestra parts that was happening while I was playing. And that really kept me actually a little more relaxed in the audition. And I think when I got to meet the committee members after, they told me that my sound and everything was very beautiful and felt relaxed when they heard me play. And that approach maybe kept me more calm, not thinking about my own playing, but thought about other people's playing and try to play along with what I heard in the recording.
Yeah, for sure. And I know we talked about it in private, but you mentioned in the super finals, it was actually the Mozart concerto that the committee felt that convinced them to ultimately give you the job. So, was there something that you felt you did different when you performed that Mozart concerto?
At that point, I think when I got to that round, I wasn't thinking much. I was too tired too, but I told myself if they heard me this much, I have nothing to lose. I'm going to just play how I play and not worry about making mistakes and just play as freely as I could. Just try to play the music as beautifully as it could. And that was my approach to it. And I don't even remember how it went, but I just try to let the music sing as much as I could. And somehow I think it moved the community's hearts. And so grateful that they accepted me into their orchestra. So it was just try to play as beautiful music as I could.
Yeah,
With,
absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
it's obviously a great opportunity. And so it's been a couple years since that audition, and you've sort of settled down and you were awarded the 10 years. So big congratulations on that. Just transitioning into full time orchestra life, obviously, you left the New World Symphony to pursue this new opportunity. Was it as you thought it would be? Were there any surprises?
For me, not so much. It was actually a very smooth transition, and the people in the orchestra were so warm and welcoming, and they really helped me settle down into the orchestra and the work life and just into the city. And the work-life balance has been wonderful for me, and the people in the orchestra have been so welcoming, supportive, and it has been a good, wonderful 2 years for me overall. And I'm so grateful to be working in the city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any memorable performances since joining the symphony?
One of the most memorable performances I had with the Grand Rapids Symphony was with the music director Marcel Leininger with Yo-Yo Ma. We performed the Dvorak Cello Concerto with him, and playing with Yo-Yo Ma was very, very inspiring because he felt so relaxed and felt like he was just improvising on stage when he was performing.
Yeah, I'm sure that was an amazing experience. And he has so much experience performing, of course, although it's still hard each and every time. And of course, the Dvorak Cello Concerto is the premier cello concerto of the cello concerto repertoire. And I know how amazing that orchestra part is, how emotional it is. And so it's kind of like playing the New World Symphony. Other than in orchestra or maybe in orchestra, were there any memorable performances that you've given in your entire musical career?
Wow, Steven, you're making me think here. Well, one of the most memorable performances I remember was actually performing at New World. We played Mahler 6 with Yuka-Pekka Saraste. During that week, my stand partner was one of the guest faculty. I think he was the concertmaster of the Florida Orchestra. His name was Vic. I remember sitting next to him and working with an amazing conductor. I remember his presence on the podium, and the music is so lush, passionate, and it had an intensity throughout the whole performance. There was like an hour intensity starts to finish, and it was just it kept me on the edge throughout the whole performance. And I think it was such a compelling and captivating performance I've ever experienced and performed.
Yeah, obviously
Yeah.
the Mahler Sixth Symphony, all Mahler symphonies are some of the greatest works ever written, and that conductor in particular is one of the premier conductors of our classical world. So that must have been an amazing experience. And I didn't know that you sat next to that concertmaster, so that must have been very inspiring as well. So you mentioned you've been in the Grand Rapids Symphony for about 2 years. I'm just curious if there's any other career aspirations you have, such as in teaching, because obviously you've achieved your goal of joining a professional orchestra, which I think is a goal of many classical musicians. But is there anything else you wish to do in your career?
My biggest aspiration when I was younger was to perform solo and hopefully teach one day. And teaching has been one of my biggest passions in my life. And if there's never an opportunity, if I have the time and energy, I would love to hopefully have a teaching job, teach somewhere, and help as many students as I can. In general, just performing what I'm doing now is already a dream. I'm so grateful for what I'm doing right now. But if I were to expand on it, teaching would be the big next step for me.
Yeah, and you've mentioned that you have a lot of passion and ideas about teaching. And so I think generally for teachers that teach well, they have a lot of thought process and they like to analyze things. And I personally am the same. So I'm just curious, did a lot of those philosophies stem out of your own understanding of the instrument, which of course it does, but were there any struggles that you had on your instrument that maybe propelled you to become a better teacher?
Yes, absolutely, Stephen. From my upbringing, moving around to so many different cities and meeting all kinds of teachers, I received a lot of different feedback and philosophy about violin playing. And maybe through all those things, I had to figure out a way that worked best for my playing. And it's just, I had to really think and figure out what works best for me. And I had to really analyze how others perform and what works best for me. And through all the wonderful teachers that I met, made me want to help other people to not hopefully fall in some of the pitfalls I went through. And I hope that through teaching, they could avoid that and have a wonderful musical journey in their lives as well.
Yes, absolutely. And knowing you, we've had a lot of discussions about violin playing, and you are also very analytical and you like to explain things because I think through the process of explaining can one really understand what they're doing. But it's kind of a paradox because a lot of good players, they actually can't really understand and explain what it is that makes them so good. So it's this really cool paradox. And I think maybe just for certain people, teaching is maybe their best fit. Although obviously you can still play very well as a great teacher. I'm just curious because I know you have a friendship with the violinist Kerson Leong, and obviously he is a phenomenal player. And I'm just curious, how did he inspire your own playing?
First and foremost, he has been a dear childhood friend of mine since I was, I think, 13 back in Ottawa. I met him at the Pinchas Zukerman's music program. And when I met him, we just kind of clicked. And knowing that we lived in the same city, I would meet up with him and talk about all kinds of things, music, food, and just getting to know him better. And we would spend time at his home and play some music together, talk about music, play some video games. I remember when he would start demonstrating violin things, just goofing around on the violin. I was just so inspired and so amazed by how beautiful he played the violin. And it really kept me in awe. I wanted to just go home and emulate what I heard. And it was just really inspiring to see a friend who was someone who was similar age as me could produce such beautiful sound. And it was a very memorable experience for me too. And so happy to have a friend that have similar passion and someone we could really relate and understand each other.
Yeah, that's amazing that you had a friendship like that. And you mentioned you guys are still friends to this day. So that's obviously very special. And it's funny you mentioned 13 because I believe he won the junior menuhin competition when he was 10 or 13.
Yeah, I think he won when he was 13, but I met him right after the competition that summer, and we started hanging around since.
I'm curious, what was the most difficult thing you dealt with in your musical career? What was your biggest breakthrough, so to speak? And I guess maybe if you could tie that into maybe some advice you'd give for young professional classical musicians.
I'm sure every musician goes through hardships and difficult obstacles in their lives, and they have to overcome it. And for me, the most difficult obstacles were preparing for orchestra auditions. It was full of rejection and a lot of time, energy, commitment to it. And it was really sometimes self-defeating, and you work many hours a day practicing and try to get better and better, but sometimes the results don't show that. But I realized recording myself and listening back, I realized over time, looking back to my old recordings, every audition really made me prepare better for the next audition. And it was really a gruesome experience, but it really helped me develop into a more refined and polished musician slash violinist that I am today. So I hope people don't give up, and I'm sure anybody will get there.
Yeah, I think that sort of faith is very important and the knowledge that everyone's going to go through difficult times. I'm just curious what sort of external hobbies you have outside of music, because I know you're a very focused person. You practice a lot and you think a lot about music, but what sort of things inspire you outside of the music world?
Music has been a big part of my life, but recently I love food. I'm a big foodie. I've been watching a lot of cooking shows, and I want to try to become a better cook. And I realized that watching those cooking shows, that I see a lot of similarities between music and cooking. And it's fun to find something that's similar to music, but I don't have to always perform at my best. And knowing myself that I love to eat, I love finding different combinations of things to make food. Everybody knows food, everybody loves good food. So I find a lot of enjoyment in that as well.
Yeah, I am personally not really much of a cook, but I think it's actually extremely similar, the two fields, because with cooking, you spend a lot of time preparing and it takes some creativity, the top cooks, to make a really interesting and good tasting recipe. And
Mhm.
the result is also very clear. It's a experience for the audience to enjoy. It's amazing the different parallels you can draw from classical music to literally any other field. I think it's so similar, and of course, it being a hobby, you're able to enjoy that process maybe a little bit more than you would music. But I think ultimately, though, music being our profession, it's also something we enjoy the most deeply as well. Okay, great. Well, with that, I will like to ask, as per usual, every single week, the practice tip of the week and the recording recommendation. This week, Jaewon, could you let us know what is your practice tip of the week?
Always record yourself, listen back, and be objective with yourself, which is never easy to do. But you know what they say, no pain, no gain. But it really, that has been the biggest help for me. And that has always been consistent and has been helping me for every important audition or important performance I had to prepare.
Yeah. And so do you go through that process every single time you practice, essentially?
Yes, every single time. Sometimes I don't want to do it, but I force myself to do it because ultimately, in the end, it will make you better. It kind of feels like working out a little bit. You don't regret after you do it.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because I personally can record more, I think, in terms of my practicing. But I'm curious, how much do you think it is important to be able to listen to yourself while you're actually playing versus recording? Because I think while the benefit of recording is that you have that honest feedback when you're listening back to yourself, but actually, from my experience, while there are things in the recording that maybe I didn't hear, I
True.
think if you get to maybe a high enough level, or if your awareness increases, I think maybe you should get to a level where you feel that you know how you performed. And yes, maybe one or two slips or a little scratch here or there, maybe you didn't catch in the moment, but I think essentially you should basically be able to hear yourself in real time back. I guess I personally rely on that more than recording, but do you think that's also very important as well?
I think so too. Yeah, ultimately, when you do perform on stage or performing for somebody, you have to know how it actually sounds under your ears. So ultimately, when you do record yourself, you're going to hear back how you actually sound when you're playing it. So you want to make sure you remember the sensation, how it sounds under your ear when you're playing it in comparison to how it sounds in the recording. If you know how it feels under your violin, if you remember how it feels when you're playing, and if you know how it sounds out there, and if you could adjust that, then ultimately you'll eventually won't need to rely too much on the recording. And recording is just a crutch for you to be able to self-realize how you play on your instrument.
Awesome. So let's hear your recording recommendation of the week.
The recording recommendation of the week that I really think everybody, if they have a chance to listen to, is the Frank Peter Zimmermann recording of the Bruch Violin Concerto with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. It's just amazing, the character that he brings out in the piece, and I hope everybody could listen to it because it's so beautiful and elegant the way he plays it.
Yeah. Is Bruch one of your favorite concertos? And what about Frank Peter Zimmermann's playing do you think is special?
Well, everybody knows the Bruch Violin Concerto. Everybody knows how the piece should be played and how it's played. And hearing him play was a kind of a completely fresh take. It felt so light. It felt so youthful. It was beautiful, lush, especially the third movement. It felt like I was youthful instead of recordings I would hear before I heard his recording. I would hear the third movement being very thick and projective, but when I heard Frank Peter Zimmermann play it, it was just so light and elegant, and it was so youthful like. I was dancing to it when I was listening to his recording.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, he's a phenomenal violinist, has an amazing technique, and has a very virtuosic technique, I would say. He can really play and express fully. So I will be sure to check that out. Well, with that, that will conclude episode 26 of A Musical Soliloquy. Thanks so much, Jaewon Seo, for joining me in today's episode, and I'd be happy to have you on in the future.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Bye.